In the past few lessons, we were discussing API versioning, and in this lesson, I want to stir up a new idea in your head and possibly make you consider if API versioning is even the right solution for the problem that we are trying to solve. In this lesson, I want to introduce you to API change management. Here's a funny joke that I found while researching for this course, and it says some people, when confronted with a problem, think, I know, I'll use versioning. Now they have 2.1.0 problems. So let's discuss what are some of the problems of API versioning and why we might consider a different solution. First, API versioning is fundamentally flawed. We don't version our APIs, we evolve our APIs because we always have to support existing clients, and being forced to support multiple API versions in the same product just doesn't make a lot of sense. If we just go ahead and delete our old API versions, then we risk breaking existing clients. And depending on how many clients we have integrating with our API, the scale of this problem could be smaller or larger. Also, maintaining old versions of our API has a cost. We always have to keep in mind that the old version exists when making an API change. We have to make sure that what we change doesn't break the old version while keeping the current version always up and running, and all of this adds development time and increases your cost for maintaining your API. Not to mention that maintaining 2 or even more versions of an API makes your code much harder to understand. So if API versioning has all of these problems attached, what is some alternative solution that we could consider? Let me introduce you to API change management. Instead of versioning our APIs, we will consider how we can manage the changes that we need to make inside of our APIs. You can think of this as so-called compatible versioning. In essence, all changes that we make to our API have to be backwards compatible. That way, we don't need to version our API at all. Any change that we make doesn't break existing clients, and we have an easy way to help our clients migrate to use the latest functionality that we exposed in a given API endpoint. So if this seems interesting, let's consider how we could approach implementing change management in practice. So we have to consider a couple of things here. What should we version in our API and what shouldn't we version? How do we extend our API if we want to introduce new functionality or change our representations? How do we introduce breaking changes if we are absolutely forced to make a breaking change? And how do we deprecate old API versions? If we figure out all of these things, then we will have a good plan for our API change management strategy that's going to minimize the number of breaking changes that we need to make and basically eliminate the need to do API versioning. So let's first consider what not to version. We don't want to version our resources. We don't want to version our relations between the resources. We don't want to version our API. What we can version is the representations or messages of our API that we accept as requests or return as responses, and we can also version the descriptions of our API. So let's assume we understand what we don't want to version, then what should we do next? If we follow a couple of simple rules when extending our API, we can make sure that we never introduce a breaking change. All we have to do is to never remove anything on our API. We can't change the business rules. We can't make optional things required, and anything new that we introduce on our API has to be optional. If we respect these 4 rules, then any change we make inside of our REST API is going to be backwards compatible. And this eliminates the need for API versioning. Now obviously, this won't make sense in every occasion. For example, sometimes we absolutely have to change the business rule. Well, what should we do in that case? As I said, it's unrealistic that we can avoid breaking changes forever. So when we do have to make a breaking change, how do we approach it without using API versioning? The first thing is when we have to make a change to the API itself. Let's say that our business rule changes and we have to modify our API endpoint, but making this change is going to break all of our existing clients. So in this case, we should simply create a new variant of our resource. This can be a new API endpoint that will implement our new business rule. You can effectively consider this as API versioning, and using media types for API versioning, we could implement something like this without having to change the API contract. But of course, exposing a new resource is the more REST compliant way, where the new resource or the new API endpoint will better describe what is the new functionality. If we need to make a change in the representation of our resource, what we are returning as a response, then we can resolve this using content negotiation. We can define a new media type to represent the change that we want to make, and then give our clients the option to use either the old media type or the new media type, and this also lets us avoid API versioning. This is something I demonstrated in the content negotiation lesson, so you can go back to that and rewatch it in light of our discussion about API change management. But we could also use simple media type versioning to implement content negotiation like this when we need to make a change to our representation of a resource. So it can really be this simple. When we need to make a change to our business rules, we can define a new resource. When we need to modify our representation, then we can use content negotiation to solve this. So let's say we made a breaking change in our API. How do we proceed with communicating this back to our clients? This brings us to our last component of our API change management strategy, which is maintenance. We first start by marking our old resources as deprecated. This can be your resource representations or your API endpoints, and you mark them as deprecated in both your API and your API documentation. Then you need to clearly communicate with your clients what is the deprecation plan. You can decide how long you want to support the old resource, and everything we are discussing here also applies if you are using API versioning. This is essentially how you can approach deprecating old API versions. It's very important to have good monitoring tools at this step so that you can monitor how many of your clients have migrated over to the new version of the resource or the new API version, and so that you can also know who are the clients still using the old version so that you can notify them to move to the new one. Finally, after some time has passed and your monitoring confirms that your old resource variant is no longer in use, you can go ahead and simply remove it from your API. And this completes our API change management strategy. Now, let me show you a practical example of all of this. Let's look at our habit resource representation, and we'll use the example of our two timestamps. Right now, they end in UTC, and I demonstrated in the previous lesson that if we just change the name and start returning the new resource, this would be a breaking change. First of all, we would break any existing data shaping implementations that were using the old field names, and this is something that we want to avoid. So let's apply our change management strategy. We want to modify the name of our resources. This is a breaking change. So what can we do? We can introduce a new representation of this resource that includes the updated property names. Then we could let our clients do content negotiation to determine which representation they should get back. Because remember, if we just update the field names, we would be introducing a breaking change. Now, another option to consider is what if we were to add the new properties with the updated names as part of the same response? This would make the new properties optional. It wouldn't be a breaking change to any existing clients because adding new fields isn't a breaking change. And after making this change, we can notify them that they should start using the new fields as the old ones will be deprecated. Now, this is just a simple example of naming things, but this could also be restructuring any complex properties. For example, if I want to modify the frequency or target, which are nested types in this representation, then this would constitute a larger breaking change. But adding some new fields isn't a breaking change, and it brings us one step closer to the representation that we are trying to reach. So we make this optional change, we communicate this to our clients, and we give them some time to switch over to the new version. Finally, after enough time has passed, we remove the old variant, represented by the old property names from this representation, and simply start returning the new representation of this resource. And this is how you can approach making changes in your API in a backwards compatible way without having to resort to API versioning. So I hope you enjoyed what we covered as part of this chapter. I introduced you to HateOS and how to use hypermedia to drive the behavior inside of our REST API. I demonstrated how to implement HateOS in our DevHabit application, and we also discussed how to approach API versioning and why API versioning might not be the best solution for REST APIs. Finally, we finished off with this lesson about API change management, and I think this is one of the most important lessons, next to HateOS of course, that I recommend rewatching a couple of times until it sticks with you. In our next chapter, we will be talking about authentication and authorization in REST APIs.